You know, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. How can one single ancient prophecy seem to come true twice? Well, today we're going to dive into three powerful verses from the book of Isaiah that do exactly that. We'll explore how one text can speak to two totally different moments in history.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. We'll go verse by verse and look at each one through two different lenses. First, we'll see what it meant for the people returning from the Babylonian exile. Then we'll jump forward to see how it was understood during the ministry of Christ centuries later. It's pretty cool to see how these layers of meaning just unfold.
Okay, so let's jump right in with verse 3. This passage just kicks things off with this huge explosion of joy, a massive national celebration. So what's all the excitement about?
So here's the text from the King James Version. And right away, you might notice something a little weird. That part that says, "and not increase the joy," it kind of sticks out, right? Well, hang on to that thought, because it's a super important point with a really fascinating backstory that we're going to get to in just a minute.
You see, this verse is a classic example of what scholars call a dual prophecy. It's basically pointing to two completely separate, but kind of parallel celebrations in history.
First up, let's rewind to the original historical setting. We're talking 538 BC. Cyrus the Great has just rolled into Babylon and freed the Jewish people after 70 long, hard years in captivity. Can you even imagine the relief? This verse is all about capturing that incredible joy of a nation finally getting to go home.
And to really get this feeling across, Isaiah uses these two amazing metaphors. First, think about the pure satisfaction of a successful harvest after a whole season of backbreaking work. And then picture the absolute triumph of soldiers dividing up the loot after a huge, hard-won battle. I mean, both of those just scream ultimate success and deliverance, right?
Okay, now let's hit the fast forward button and jump to that second interpretation. In the first century, when people read the line, "Thou hast multiplied the nation," they saw something else. They saw the fulfillment of that ancient promise God made to Abraham. You know, the one about making his descendants into a great nation.
And this brings us right back to that weird phrase I told you to remember. It turns out a lot of ancient Hebrew manuscripts have a different reading. Instead of "not increase the joy," they actually say "increased their joy." Now that might seem like a tiny change, but it's huge. It makes the verse fit perfectly with the second prophetic meaning of a nation just overflowing with joy because God kept his promise. All right, moving on to verse 4, this is where the prophecy builds on that theme of joy. It shifts focus a little bit to tell us why everyone's so happy. And the reason? Breaking free from oppression. Man, the language here is just so vivid. He doesn't just say they were freed. No, he gives us these three super powerful images of what oppression feels like. A heavy yoke digging into your neck, a staff beating on your shoulder, and the rod of your oppressor. You can almost feel that physical weight just being lifted off. So what's up with this yoke? What does it really symbolize? Well, it's way more than just a piece of wood for an ox. It's this powerful metaphor for slavery and being crushed under someone's thumb. And what's cool is it works perfectly for both of the historical moments we're looking at. So back in 538 BC, this is about as literal as it gets. The yoke was the actual crushing burden of slavery under the Babylonian Empire. When that yoke breaks, it's talking about the exact moment Cyrus the Great set the Jews free, literally lifting the rod of their oppressor off their shoulders. Now, fast forward again to the 1st century, and this yoke takes on a whole new meaning. Prophetically, it's seen as the heavy burden of all these man-made religious rules that the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders back then, had piled on top of people. These laws had become totally oppressive. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this quote from Matthew just nails that spiritual interpretation. Christ speaks directly to the people who are heavy laden, weighed down, and he offers them a different kind of yoke. He calls his gospel easy and says it brings rest. It's this perfect, stark contrast between the crushing yoke of man-made rules and the freeing yoke of God. Oh, and the verse also drops this reference to the Day of Midian. What's that about? Well, it's a throwback to the story of Gideon in the book of Judges. See, Gideon defeated this massive army with just 300 guys. It was a victory that was so impossible it was designed to prove one thing: their rescue came from God, not from their own power. And adding that little detail just drives home the point that in both of these fulfillments we're talking about, the liberation is a divine act. Okay, finally we get to verse 5.
And this one gives us this super dramatic picture of what happens after this incredible deliverance. It's a victory that is sealed by fire.
This verse sets up a really stark contrast. Think about a normal battle. It's all chaos, noise, blood, and confusion. But this victory, it's different. It's final. It's decisive. And the symbol for it isn't the clash of swords, but this all-consuming, cleansing fire. Now, historically, this totally makes sense. It points to a common practice in the ancient world. When an army won a huge victory, they'd gather up all the enemy's stuff, armor, chariots, weapons, the whole shebang, and throw it all onto a massive bonfire. It was like a giant public declaration that, "We won! It's over!"
And you see this mentioned in other ancient texts too, like here in Ezekiel. See, burning the weapons wasn't just about getting rid of them. It was this incredibly powerful symbol. It meant the war was well and truly over. The enemy was so completely beaten that their tools of war were now just firewood.
So, what about the prophetic meaning? Well, in that sense, the fire becomes spiritual. It symbolizes a final, decisive spiritual victory. A victory so complete that it brings in an age of peace where weapons are just obsolete. You don't need them anymore. It's kind of like that famous idea of turning swords into plowshares. Okay, so let's zoom out and pull all these threads together. Let's look at the incredible picture Isaiah is painting across these 3 verses.
You can see it all laid out right here. Every single image in the prophecy has this amazing parallel fulfillment. The increased joy in verse 3. It goes from the historical joy of being freed from Babylon to the spiritual joy of the gospel spreading. The broken yoke in verse 4, that goes from the end of actual slavery to freedom from crushing religious rules. And that burning fire in verse 5, it transforms from a literal bonfire of weapons into a symbol of a final, lasting spiritual peace.
And what this shows us is a really common pattern you see in this kind of prophecy. The historical event, in this case, the freedom from Babylon, it acts as a type, or like a foreshadowing, of the ultimate spiritual deliverance that comes later. So the first fulfillment is totally real, it's historical, but it's also pointing forward to something even bigger.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It suggests that prophecies like this are so much more than just a single prediction. They're actually revealing these patterns of deliverance that echo down through history. And that leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to think about, doesn't it? How does looking through this kind of dual lens change the way we read these ancient, incredibly layered and powerful texts?